Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thanks for coming. So you've heard me for over 36 years now, and you're still coming to hear me. Sorry about that. Let's pray. Holy God, we thank you for our life together, for the rich history of mission and ministry that we've enjoyed in this place. We spend some time this morning remembering, knowing and understanding that the seeds of the past bear fruit for the future. So as we think about our history and our time together, bless this time of conversation, that it would lead us to greater mission and ministry in the days to come, for the sake of your Son, in whose name we pray. Amen. Amen. So, you could kind of look at these next 4 weeks, as many as you're able to come to, as sort of your exit interview with me. And we'll have to do an exit interview with the congregation council, if you can believe it. That's the way a pastor leaves a congregation. So at my last council meeting, I have a hard time with those last things. I will have to do an exit interview with them. And our parish records will be certified by our council secretary, Eric Gregerson. He will sign off. And after the exit interview with the council, I will send that all into the synod, and that will be the mechanism by which I can move on to some further place. I don't have the name of that place yet, so that seems to be the most popular question these days, where you're going, but nobody assigned them the dotted line. I think I know where I'm going, but technically until we both agreed to it, the congregation and me, that I'm not supposed to say. My hope is to start there December 1st. So, I thought with these conversations, I would try and pass on to you, who will remain behind, some of the stories, significant stories, I think, of Tree of Life, because you will become the new storytellers, right? You have been telling these stories all along. It's just that I guess I have the personal corporate memory from the very beginning. So maybe I'll fill in some blanks in some of the stories you've heard before. Today I'd like to talk about the early years, to add a little bit more John Prine into the conversation. That boundless love. I mean, how good is it? Dave has to close his ears because he missed the early service. But how wonderful is it to begin your service with Alison Krauss and to end it with John Prine? It just doesn't get any better than that. So I'm grateful for the praise band today. I was, my first congregation, many of you know, was in Carlisle. I was the associate pastor at St. Paul's, Carlisle, for 4 years. When I was called there and started in June of 1983, and Kathy and I, a month before, began to look for a place to live. We found a little apartment, we rented it, and eventually we moved there. But I told Kathy that we were moving to the wild, wild west. Carlisle just seemed so terribly remote. Nothing like metropolitan Middletown. So we were there, and we loved our congregation. It was hard to leave. Betsy and Andrew were both born there, both baptized there. We loved the members of that congregation. It was a large congregation. It got even bigger while I was there. We were worshiping over 450 people at our 2 services on Sunday morning. A lot of new young people joining. It was rough to leave. I knew a year ahead of that I was feeling ready to be the senior pastor somewhere. That it was a little hard being an associate and having to follow all the traditions that had built up in a long, old, historic congregation. So here's pretty much the full story, which I've only told sporadically here and there. But sometime in the mid-fall of 1986, I called the Central Pennsylvania Synod office and spoke to a staff member there because I learned that a friend of mine, Pastor Ron Van Blargen, if any of you know him, Ron was just a good friend of mine, lovely man, right? And he was getting ready to leave Christ Lingelstown.
I know where he went.
So Christ Lingelstown, as you know, is about 20 minutes from Middletown, closer to the center of the universe. And for me, it was on the East Shore. That did make a difference for me. So I called and said to the staff member, who will be nameless, and I said, could my name be put in at Christ Lingelstown? And the bishop's staff member said, Pastor Geib, you are way too young for that congregation.
Oh, wow.
So I was about to turn 29. Now you'd be lucky to find a 29-year-old pastor. There aren't that many, right? But I would say I'm sure in retrospect that he sort of kicked himself for saying no, because I think I would have been perfectly fine at Christ Lingelstown. So that was a no, and then Kathy and I had a vacation Sunday, and we drove to Columbia, Maryland, where we worshiped with a new mission congregation, meeting in an elementary school, sitting on tiny little elementary school size cafeteria chairs. The knees worked much better back then. We left that service, drove back to Carlisle. I looked at Kathy and said, that was the most fun I've had in church ever. And we just need to do that sometime. So that word circled out, and within just a few weeks, that same bishop staff member called me in the phone and said, Pastor Geib, I know you were disappointed about Christ Lingelstown, but I think we may have stumbled on something that you would even like to do better, and you would be well suited at it. And that is to start a new mission congregation. So there was a bit of a pause over the phone. I remember that because I think he was expecting me to jump for joy. But the issue is, where in all of central Pennsylvania can you not get to a Lutheran church within 30 seconds? Right? At that time, they were everywhere. Think of where we're sitting here today. Just out of curiosity, how many of you pass another Lutheran church on your way to this one? I mean, pass in a geographical area, right? Probably almost all of us do, except for me, or if you live in Deer Path Woods, because they're just everywhere. And if you think back to 1986, there were even more, right? Because we've closed some congregations since then. So anyways, they said, well, that's, kind of interesting. Where are you thinking? And he says, in Susquehanna Township. And I said to the bishop's staff person, Susquehanna Township. Nobody lives in Susquehanna Township but farmers. There's nobody there but farmers. When I lived in metropolitan Middletown, we came out to Susquehanna Township to whoop up on the farmers in sports. I mean, that's it. It was this whole area, right? Just farmland. Who lived out there? I could name the Hocker family and, the Beauforts. But nobody lived out here, at least not on this side of 81. He says, Pastor Geib, when's the last time you were in Susquehanna Township? 1975. Well, things have changed a little bit. So I said, Kathy and I are going to need some time to think and pray and really talk at least with Johanna. The younger kids probably would have been disinterested. They weren't old enough, really. You guys can bring in some folding chairs from out there. Yeah, they'd have to crawl through you then. Maybe they'd put them back there. So on a Sunday afternoon, Kathy and I loaded up the kids in the car and we drove to Susquehanna Township. And we knew that the site was on the corner at this intersection. We got confused. We thought it was the opposite corner. We didn't realize it was this corner. Regardless, we drove around Susquehanna Township and noticed that things had changed. So we waited till after Christmas. We asked to have past Christmas to make a decision. Called back the bishop's office and said, I think I want to try it. And then I think in April, I told the senior pastor, Dick Ruff, who really was just a wonderful mentor for me. All right. Even though I was a PK, I literally had a 4-year internship. I was not nearly as sophisticated as Jay when he came here. I don't think Pastor Ruff taught me much about work ethic. I've always been a hard worker, but he really gave me great instructions about just the life of a pastor. So I guess sometime late April, maybe early May, we announced to the congregation. Part of the agreement was that I would be trained to do mission development. And what was at that time the Lutheran Church in America sent me to Omaha, Nebraska to be trained. Kathy went with me. That meant we did not fly. It is a long drive to Omaha, Nebraska.
1,200 miles.
Is it?
Yeah, we just went to Lincoln.
I don't remember how many nights we spent in the road, but the first half of the trip, well, about the time Kathy had a panic attack as we crossed the bridge going over the Mississippi River, we had decided on the church name. We had talked about the name for the congregation for hundreds of miles. And we had agreed upon certain qualities. Had to be biblical, could not be a saint's name. No more Saints Pauls and Peters and James, etc. It had to connect with normal, real life people. We wanted the name to be accessible, particularly understanding that some of the people that would come to this new congregation would likely not have had a mature experience in the church, and that was certainly true in our early years. It had to have notions of new life, and healing and starting over. And knowing that we sat at that time in the epicenter of central Pennsylvania Judaism, it had to be a name that connected with our Jewish neighbors in a positive way. So in Hebrew, Tree of Life is Eitz Chaim. Eitz Chaim, Tree of Life. For our Jewish neighbors, Eitz Chaim is the Torah. You couldn't have hit it any better than that, at least I think. Curiously, when Kathy's dad moved in with us and brought his little Volkswagen to drive for a few years with 975,000 miles and no radio or air conditioning, his license plate, Eitz Chaim.
Oh.
Yeah, it was. I looked at that and I said, Ken, I didn't know you spoke Hebrew. And he looked at me, what are you talking about, Richard? I told him about his license plate. So the rule of thumb was at that time, you pick 3 names, you give them to the bishop. The bishop at that time was Bishop Edmonston. It was a Bishop Edmonston. He was just coming into office, I think, at that time. And Kathy and I could not find a name that we liked any better to that. So a few weeks later when we got back, we sent him the name. And we said, if you really don't like this, then we'll try again. But he really liked it too. So the only problem is he wanted to serve evangelical in there. Tree of Life Evangelical Lutheran Church. That is a lot of writing, you know, a lot of words. And, you know, even then, that word evangelical had all kinds of loaded stuff with it. People really, then and now, don't understand what it means. And some of the associations had become negative, right? Because, you know, by the time I started knocking on doors, all that stuff with Jimmy Swagger, Jerry Falwell, but who's the Baker, Jim Baker. All that stuff was going on. So, you know, there were a lot of negative images about the church floating around at that time. We went house hunting with a representative of the LCA, a guy by the name of Fred Woolleen, big southern guy from Atlanta. He's dead now. He took us around, showed us a whole bunch of houses, and we landed on the one in Deer Path Woods. He landed on the same one. That became the house that the LCA bought for us to live in until you started to pay for it, until you said you didn't want to pay for it anymore, and we started to pay for it. That's kind of how that worked. It was a good choice because when the choir finally got started and we met and sang in our house, that the cul-de-sac could hold about 20 to 25 cars packed behind each other. So you couldn't leave till the people behind you left. That's how it worked. So we're trained with probably about 24 other mission developers. Many of their spouses came with them, so Kathy's presence wasn't unusual. The guy from the LCA who did the training was a guy by the name of Mac Minnick. And while I never really asked him this, I sensed intuitively that he was not on board with this new start. Probably because of the number of Lutheran congregations that already existed in the area. I think he didn't like that and felt that there would be slim pickings. But truthfully, I don't really think he was all that on board with me personally. I'm not exactly sure why, but I guess I didn't charm him very well. He was a hard man to please and a hard man to charm. But he did his job, and part of the reason he did his job and I got in is because by then, Kathy's dad was the CEO of the Division for Mission in North America, right? The property for Tree of Life was purchased when Ken was just starting in that role. This land that we're sitting on was purchased by the Central Pennsylvania Synod in 1971. And Kathy's dad signed the dotted line, but a Lutheran pastor and Mr. Stan Custer Sr., who developed originally Mountaindale, he's now deceased, right? His son Stan Jr. runs the show. I think he still does. But Stan Sr. stood out there about where the church sign is. And he shook hands with a Lutheran pastor who worked for the president of the synod at that time. Ready? Now you'll really date yourself. His name was Martin Tozer. Anybody? Historically, not him though. Yeah, not him. I don't think it's him. You don't remember him? He had a nickname. This is it. Tozer the, what rhymes with Tozer? Closer. So he had already developed this unbelievable reputation as the pastor who would show up, and when he showed up at your church, it meant he was coming to your church to help close it down. I imagine he was a great pastor, but he had a hard, tough reputation. This is in the 1970s and the 1960s, that there were so many Lutheran churches at that time in the synod that they just couldn't all be sustained. But Martin Tozer left one positive legacy. He signed on behalf of the synod to buy this site where we're located. So the land was owned since 1971. They no sooner bought it than they forgot all about it. And in 1977, somebody came across the deed in the synod office. And the story is that the staff looked at each other and said, you know, we own 2.65 acres on the corner of Far Green and Linglestown Road. What are we going to do with that? Should we just get rid of it? You know, because we haven't done anything. And initially there were some thoughts that it would be a nursing home, a Lutheran nursing home. But you know, less than 3 acres for a nursing home, even at that time, seemed a bit small. So they decided that they should send somebody out to agricultural Susquehanna Township and find out what's happening. They did that in 1977. A pastor went door to door. And Mountaindale was building, and Beaufort Farms was building or built up. The lowest end, I think, of Deer Path Woods was starting. The upper end of Crook Hill Farms was starting. Beaufort Hunt was in full gear. And he came back and said, wow, things have changed since we bought that land. And this is the part of the story you may remember because it's my favorite part of the story. It was all because Susquehanna Township was finally putting in sewer lines up and down Linglestown Road. Tree of Life was built on the flow of poop. Such an awesome part of the story. So that's 1977, and remember when I got the phone call? 1986.
Wow.
Yeah, 9 years, and you know, I've thought about that over and over and over again, and what would have happened had we even got started with this development sooner. It wouldn't have included me, that's one thing, but I do feel like maybe the synod missed that early stage of growth because it was delayed. This corner was chosen by one of Ken's staff members, a Japanese Lutheran, who had developed this whole theology called point of breaks. And you know this because you've seen it in your own life, but there's also an application for church growth. And that is, when something ends, something new begins. Amen?
Amen.
Amen. When something ends, something new begins. That is your mantra now as you deal with some level of grief and I depart. Because whenever there's an ending, there's a new beginning. And I'm just going to say this. You would dishonor my memory and your affection for me if you didn't plug away and continue the mission. You know that, right? You're not going to do me any good if you get pissed off because I leave and don't continue the mission. This is a great mission. It's incredible what has been done by this congregation. But this Japanese Lutheran pastor just had a knack for choosing building sites. So he actually showed up over here and he had an empty wine bottle. And he looked at the corners that were available at that time. At that time, it would have been 3 out of 4. The governor lived over there or whatever in the corner, the big house, that was already there. But the other 3 were vacant, the office, this one and that one. And what he wanted to do is to choose the most visible site for the building. He placed the wine bottle on the cork of the wine bottle on the site. And then he moved that wine bottle around. And if he wanted to see how much potential growth could fill that body of that wine bottle as he moved it around. Was there growth, potential for growth in every direction of the wine bottle? Acknowledging that the mission would kind of go like this, right? It wouldn't just stay narrow, it would grow. And when he looked at these 3 corners, he said, that's the corner. We're up in hill, right? We had greater visibility. And he anticipated growth up the mountain, down Lingelstown Road, and in that direction. All that was true. You couldn't go too much heading towards the river because the river was a natural boundary. But he was the one who said, let's talk to Mr. Custer Sr. and buy this corner. $42,000 at that time. That was a high price at that time, actually, you know, because 1971. And we got 2.65 acres. So I'm trained, Kathy's trained with me. We have a house, we move over here. Kathy's parents, by the way, watched our kids while we were out in Omaha. Then we come back, we pack up, we move over here, we get situated. My first job is to go around and meet other clergy and let them know what I'm up to so that they don't believe that I'm stealing sheep, so to speak. My second job is to meet local business people because I am knocking on doors. And it could be that I would create some anxiety. So let the business community know what you're doing. And while I'm doing that, to prepare some materials that I would need once I commence door knocking. Any questions so far? Thoughts?
Knocking on doors creates anxiety for business?
I think it wasn't, even at that time, it was avant-garde to see a clergy person knocking on doors in neighborhoods. So, for instance, I visited Earl Latchall. Everybody who's old around here remembers Earl Latchall, right?
Yep.
Who was the lumberman down the street.
Where the giant is.
And I went into the lumber yard and asked if I could meet Mr. Latchall. And his secretary said, well, I'm sorry, Pastor Geib, only if you make an appointment. So I made an appointment, went back a week later. I had to walk up his top of the steps. His office was at the top of these steep steps. I went in and I introduced myself, and Earl Latchall said something like that, something like, I hate that green book. It is printed on such cheap paper. So he was a member of St. Paul's on Green Street, which closed down a few years later. But he lived right over there.
Right.
And so, long after the door knocking had commenced and we finally had an interest meeting at Herbert Hoover School, Earl and Belle Latchall showed up. They came to the interest meeting. I still have the sheet of paper somewhere where they signed in the dotted line. They came to the first service. Belle became our first treasurer. Earl was on the building committee. And the end of the building committee work was the end of Earl's presence in the church. He just wasn't on board with the building that we built. So Mac Minnick at that workshop said to all us pastor developers, you might not see success for a year or two. So find a hobby. You're going to have to find a hobby to give yourself something to do. At the end of the day, you can say, I did this. So I started to do some cleaning up old furniture and varnishing them, restoring them. So, for instance, the choir, when they sang in our house, sometimes sat on an old pew that I had refinished. And I refinished an old player piano that Charlie Miller, some of you may remember Charlie, who was on the building committee, our poorest and oldest member in the building committee, who sat on this site while this building was built every day in his electric wheelchair, which he rode down Linglestown Road from Pheasant Hills with a trucker's hat on his head that had fake seagull poop on it. That was Charlie Miller. And he was so interested and dedicated in watching this building go up every day. He sat here. The other thing I decided I would do is try and keep a journal. And I became a failure. There's some 6 or 7 entries in the journal. This is from July 1st, 1987. So now we've been here a little over a month. Been here for 1 month now, having moved out of Carlisle and into our house in Deer Path Woods on May 26th. May 15th is my last day at St. Paul's. Ugh. I'm going to have to get a reader for me to do these things. I spent it making final goodbyes to special friends. Ugh. Imagine this, it's like how many years ago? 30 years. Doc and Ruth Miller, Laura Horse, Clarence Hoy, Ella Whitmer, Mary Palmer, Tom and Carrie Sipes, Janet Glargan, and Dr. Mary. My letter of resignation went out on April 7th. I called the staff on April 5th to tell them personally. And of course, I told Pastor Ruff several weeks earlier. Palm Sunday was incredible, a weeping pastor and congregation. Goes on and on, but I won't get through it. So I tried to keep a bit of a journal for a while to record some of my feelings along the way. At the beginning of July, I had done all those other things. I started to knock on doors. I knocked on 4,000 doors in about 4 months. Half of them had no one home. So that's how you visit that many doors in that short a time, because people weren't home. But you couldn't do all your door knocking in the evening. You just had to bite the bullet and get out during the day as well, and you tried to do your best. In Mountaindale, I met mainly housekeepers who were home during the day. Every other door I went to had a mezuzah on, Jewish neighborhood. Same thing happened across the street. I sort of started in the area close to the church, and I'm thinking to myself, everybody who lives here is Jewish. Nobody's going to want to come to this church. And then I finally got down to Rodkey Road. Do you know Rodkey? Everybody know it? So when you leave church today, head towards the river, and there's this little road off to the left. And now the Jehovah's Witnesses are back there. That helps you out. But I'm telling you, I get to Rodkey Road, there's less than a dozen houses there. And I'm thinking to myself, oh, please, God, just a little success. And God answered my prayer, because at that time, Rodkey Road was like Wittenberg, Germany. Only with 10 houses. Because almost everybody who lived on Rocky Road at that time were Lutherans at one time, or were inactive Lutherans at that time. So for those of you who are old timers, you may remember the Deerdorf family, right? So the Deerdorfs, Rocky Road, Lutherans. Carl grew up in Barron's Lutheran Church in Dillsburg. Right down the street from them, a 3-generation family of, at that time, single men. One, Dale Lubold, who was divorced with kids, and his 2 brothers who lived there with him. All Lutherans at one time. Across the street, the Knoll family. So you remember Mary Knoll, who's still a member today, lives in Pheasant Hills, and her husband Marlon, just a lovely, lovely man, constable in Susquehanna Township. And then at least a couple of their girls at that time, and all Lutherans. So all those folks, or at least for a time, became members of Tree of Life. And so finally a little success. Our service area was down to the river, not across the river. Basically, technically down to Lucknow on 6th Street. And to give you just a little glimpse of how significant that was, Linda Fitzke, at that time, lived at the corner of Lucknow. She was one of the last houses I visited on that section. I mean, our lovely soprano, right? It was just, that was a result of door-to-door visits. Choir director eventually. Yeah, her prodigy. Then over to 81 as it slanted across. And then technically I was to end at Colonial Road. And I didn't. I did ask the mission director if I could go just a little bit farther on the mountainside of the road, because there were just all kinds of new houses back there. Centennial Acres was really booming at that time. Those townhouses back there on the edge of Forest Hills, booming at that time. So on the mountainside, I went as far as Patton Road and went down Patton Road. Nothing to the east side of Patton Road really was developed at that time. All those houses where the Cromers live now, that wasn't there at that time. But on the other side, there were new houses. So that became the service area. Within a few months, I had identified, I think, enough people who were interested in the congregation that I felt we could start to take a few more steps. So I go to a door, I knock or ring the bell. When somebody comes to the door, I take a step back. I don't stand and look through the screen door at them. I take a step back so that they are not anxious, right? Lower anxiety, because there's a stranger at their door. I share my spiel. Are you saved? No, just kidding. I say, my name is Richard Geib. I'm a Lutheran pastor, and we're starting a new congregation down here. And I just wanted to tell you that I'm in the neighborhood, and I had a brochure that was printed with some very basic information. We have these lovely scrapbooks in the parlor. If you ever want to look at that stuff, I think there are copies there. The brochure was, the graphics were, the logo, the Tree of Life logo, which I don't think I have here, the original one, was actually made by a member of our congregation in St. Paul's by the name of Matt Robbins, whose wife got ordained after we moved here, Aileen Robbins. And Then we hired a ambivalent Roman Catholic by the name of, I think her name was Marilyn Marjorie Emward, who put the brochure and made it look pretty with the logo and all that. And then, do you remember Ted Toshef, anybody? Toshef? You know Taylor Toshef?
Oh, yeah.
The news person?
News.
So this would have been Taylor's grandfather or great-grandfather. He had a print shop in the area at that time. The name was Your Private Printer. Anybody remember Your Private Printer? So he was kind, and they produced all this paper stuff for us. So the brochure had a business card inserted into it, so that even if they tossed the brochure, maybe they keep the business card for a little bit, so they'd have a way of get a hold of me. If the individual seemed receptive, I asked if I could come back and visit again, and I got a phone number. And then later in the week, I called up people, and I asked if I could come over and talk a little bit more. So daytimes knocking on doors, evenings going back to homes. So Carol Webb is the proof in the pudding, because I met her knocking on doors in Crooked Hill Farms. She seemed receptive. I was a George Clooney lookalike. So and she let me come back, and I had a lovely visit with her. And while she doesn't like me saying it, it took her some time to come back, though she did come back a couple times. I know.
I went to the church at Pendine.
That's true. She was a working woman, that's for sure. By the fall, we certainly had sufficient people to try and do a little bit more. I organized what was called a service committee. Who is left? Martha Parker was on that, but deceased. John Adams was on that, no longer here. A couple people were on it, have moved away. And in a very significant way, at least for me, Dolly Roberts' high school daughter, Robin. I wanted a young adult to be on this committee, and Robin showed enthusiasm and interest, so I asked her, and she was on the committee too. They helped me plan some early events, an interest meeting where people came back and I had more time to share, a Christmas caroling event down at Pheasant Hill Estates, and then the first service, which happened the end of January 1988. So we had almost 230 people at that first service, held in the gym at Herbert Hoover Elementary School. Most of them were ringers. A whole bunch of people from St. Paul's Carlisle come over and be part. Christ Lingelstown sent a bunch. Folk choir from Holy Trinity sang. Christ Lingelstown offered the flowers that day. And there we were in the basketball court, worshiping. Gradually, some of our members began to build worship utensils, tools for us. Our first altar is still, communion table is still in the loft above the church. That was built by Paul Meckley from an old door. A guy by the name of Jim Kaprocki built our first Paschal candle stand, and I think maybe the baptismal font. Scott and Diane Naugle offered a clay pitcher and the font for the baptismal stand in memory of a child that had died, that had been miscarried. Still had strong memories of that. So pieces came together, people made banners, and every Sunday morning, we got up and met early and put 100 folding chairs up. We were there for about a year. They removed asbestos from Herbert Hoover School. We had to find a new place to go. We found Camp Sertoma out in Lingelstown. That was our year in the wilderness. Bishop Edmonston's wife, Barb, who directed ARC, helped us get in there. It was so muggy and humid in that building on Sunday mornings that I went out about 6 o'clock Sunday mornings and mopped the entire floor. You just had to get the moisture up off the floor and run fans, or people would have slid and fallen on their butts. Did anybody, who is here from the charter membership? The first 144?
I should be.
You're not counting. Did anybody start to worship with us while we were at Camp Sertoma? The Cromers did. So you remember those days. Yeah.
I think Lena too. Lena Weinberg.
Oh, there are plenty of other people. I was just looking to see who was here today. So we actually had a wedding on a Sunday morning out at Camp Sertoma. You remember Sandy and Carl Brandt got married in the church service. Was that before you? Yep. Chef Charlie cooked. So we were worshiping, we came back to the school. Once all the renovations were done, we were in the cafeteria for, maybe about a year. We broke ground for this building in May of 1991. Michael May played in the trombone choir. He, by the way, is playing his trombone on All Saints Sunday this year again. You weren't listening, Michael.
He's shaking his head.
But he stood out there and played his trombone with Tom Asman. They were the two trombonists. It was great. So we break ground on May of 1991. We open our charter, and we opened our charter. When did we open our charter? I think May of 91 as well. No, I'm losing track of time.
Earlier than that.
Yeah, it was earlier than that. We broke ground in May of 91. Yeah, we opened our charter in May of 98. Of course we did.
88.
Of 1988, yeah, 88, jeez. We opened the charter, that document hanging in the wall out there, in May of 1988. Caitlin, you tell it's from here.
It's before my time.
We closed it in November of 1988. We had 148 signatures, 144, exactly 144 quote-unquote members, 3 associate members, and 1 unbaptized child whose mom could not stand the idea of not having that thumbprint. All those splotches are children's thumbprints. And so that was, I think it was Tim Nowak maybe, who wasn't baptized yet, but whose thumbprint is there. So 148 total, 144 members, 3 associate members, 1 unbaptized baby on that chart. It was remarkable to organize the congregation that quickly. So at the very next Synod Assembly, June of the next year, we were welcomed officially, but the LCA, by that time the ELCA had already put us in the records as an organized congregation. We couldn't organize until the congregation was paying my salary and we were off mission support. So by January 1st of 1989, those folks had picked up the tab for my salary and benefits. That was nothing short of a miracle, really, that it could happen that quickly. Bella loves me the most. We had an installation service at some time that year, and at the Synod Assembly in 1989, we were brought up in stage and recognized as a congregation of what was by then the Lower Susquehanna Synod. Remember, in the end of 1987 into 1988, the ELCA was coming into business. So we had 2 mission directors in our history. One was named John Schneidmiller, a lovely man, chain smoker. He was Bob and Judy Hart's pastor back in Butler before he agreed to take a job with Ken's team. And then later, a very flamboyant guy named Jarrett Hansen. Anybody remember him long ago? He had long red hair. He was very debonair. He always reminded me of kind of a swashbuckler. But he was very charismatic and preached a couple times. Both did excellent jobs, kind of motivating and prodding us along. All right, 5 minutes. Do you have questions so far in the story?
Richard, just an observation, and that is that you can watch Ken's rendition of all these events and Richard and Kathy's development. It's on YouTube under the Reverend Dr. Ken Senft, and I think the tagline was a legacy of faith or something like that. If you can get past the goof asking them questions, it's really worthwhile watching.
Any others so far?
That's the beginning. So how old were your kids when you moved in?
I think Johanna was going to 4th grade when we moved here. So how old's a 4th grader? 9. So I'm thinking Betsy and Andrew were probably about 2 and 3, something like that. They were young. You remember that Kathy was taking classes at the seminary, and she had to eventually do an internship, and so we had to find something for the kids to do while she was doing her internship, partly with Tree of Life and partly with Epiphany Lutheran Church down the road, right?
Is there some place in Pembroke that she?
Eventually she worked for Pembroke,
Okay.
or maybe, you know what, I just can't remember that piece anymore. Maybe it was Bob Collins was her supervisor, so maybe her work was at Zion at that time. But she did go back after she was ordained to be the visitation pastor. That's where her paycheck came from.
Richard, I don't know if you remember, you did come to my door.
I do remember.
Oh, do you?
Yeah.
When
And she
we-
answered it.
Yeah.
And I
She didn't-
answered.
She didn't call the cops?
And was a member of the big church at that time.
I
so,
was,
yeah.
Yes.
and then we moved to Deer Path Woods, and I wasn't real happy with the big church. It was way too big for me. And a friend told us there's this church
Yeah.
that, at Herbert Hoover, which is in walking distance from my house. And I went, and I think Kathy greeted me by hugging me, and I'm like, this is really cool.
So she drugged me there, and I go, and I recognize Lena. And it's like, you know, I'm a wallflower until I recognize someone. And then if I know somebody, it's like, okay, this is good.
So there's more to that story with Dave than he told you. Ann was very regular, Dave was a little less regular. And then in a sermon, I quoted an Alison Krauss song. And he hasn't missed church ever since.
True, it was a Godwin.
So this is a parish record. We have 2 of these. Eric Gregerson will need to certify these. This is the old school one. Here are just a couple entries into the historical event column. July 1987, door-to-door calling begins. December 20th, 1987, first fellowship event, Christmas caroling at Pheasant Hill Estates. January 10th, 1988, interest meeting at Herbert Hoover School. 62 people came to that. January 24th, 88, first worship service, 229 in attendance. And the very next Sunday, we had communion for the first time. At that time, the LCA MacMinnick said, at the most, have communion once a month. And Jay is still a little bit amazed by the reality that when I was in seminary, This was the big issue, frequency of communion,
Yeah.
right?
Used to be
And
quarterly.
churches were talking about
That
that,
one to-
it's
one is-
terribly significant. And now you have a key leader in the Lutheran Church in America saying, no, don't do that. I mean, that just went against the grain of everything I was taught. So we didn't have communion at that first service. We bent to the LCA leadership. And I looked at Kathy the next week and I said, nope, I just can't do this. We need to have communion. This is our identity. 62 people showed up the next week. No, I'm wrong about that. Like 70 people showed up. And we had first service of Word and Sacrament. We've had communion ever since. And I'll just say, I have really vivid memories of folks like Tom and Judy Crape showing up for the first time and coming back. Why did you come back? Because you have communion. Bob and Judy Hart, same thing. The frequency of communion was terribly important. First choir rehearsal, January 27th. So within 3 days of the first service, we had a choir. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
Yeah. Up until a couple years ago, we had a couple pieces of furniture in our house that Dale Warner, the first choir director, crushed during choir practice. He had cane chairs and he propped his foot up and went right through them. A week later, first children's choir rehearsal. So, we had tons of kids from the
Which
get-go.
at the time was all at your house, right?
All at our house. I gotta stop because we got church. Thanks for
Thank you.
listening.
Thank
Come
you.
back next week.